Alright, this video is going to go over how to find equilibrium price and quantity mathematically for your introductory microeconomics course. So there are 4 steps here that you'll need to go through, and you should be able to solve any of these problems. So the first step is to solve the demand and supply functions. In terms of quantity. So by this I mean you have Q equals blah 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 instead of P equals blah 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 blah. And we'll go through an example in a second. The second step is to set quantity of supply equal to quantity demanded, or you set the quantities equal to each other. The third step here is to solve for P, or equilibrium price, and the last step in this method is to plug in your equilibrium price to your quantity supplied and your quantity demanded functions to solve for equilibrium quantity. And then by plugging it into both of these and checking, you'll make sure that you did your math right and that you didn't mess anything up. So it's a good way to check your answers too. So let's go through an example. Let's imagine that our quantity demanded is equal to 10,000 minus 80p. So this is already solved for in terms of Q. It's possible that this isn't solved for in terms of Q, so for that method you would have to do some manipulation to get this solved in terms of Q. So as an example, let's take this function and solve for P. To solve this for P, we would have to add 80p to both sides, so we would get 80p equal 80p plus our QD equals 10,000, and then subtract QD from both sides, and then divide both sides by this 80, and that would give us P equals 10,000 over 80 minus QD over 80. So if you were given something that looks like this, you would want to solve for this QD. So to do that, you would want to get QD by itself, so you could add QD over 80 to both sides. So you'd get QD over 80 plus P equals 10,000 over 80. You would then subtract P from both sides to get rid of it here and subtract it over there. And then you would multiply everything by 80 to get QD equals 10,000 minus 80p. And so that's how you would get your demand function in terms of Q instead of in terms of P. So this is our demand function. Our supply function in this example is going to be 20p. And so note that these both confirm the law of demand and the law of supply. So as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. As price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. So for our typical graph, we would get downward sloping demand and upward sloping supply. So we've solved for these guys in terms of Q. We now have to set these quantities equal to each other. And the reason we do this is because in our typical supply and demand graph, we only have one equilibrium point, and that occurs at equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So we know that we're going to be at the same equilibrium quantity on both the supply curve, represented by our supply function, and the demand curve, represented by our demand function. So if we set those two guys equal to each other, we'll have 10,000 minus 80p equals 20p. So now we can add 80p to both sides, and we will get 10,000 equals 100p. So we get 10,000 equals 100p. If we divide both sides by 100, we get 100 equals p. So we now know that our equilibrium price is 100. And we know this represents the price where these two guys cross. So if we plug in this p value now into our supply function and our demand function, we should get that same quantity back out. So let's test it and see what happens. We know the equilibrium price equals 100. Our supply function equal 20 times p. So if we plug in our equilibrium price, we get 20 times 100, and 20 times 100 is 2,000. So our equilibrium quantity should be 2,000. But let's plug it into our demand function just to make sure. So our demand function was 10,000 minus 80p. So if we plug in that 100, for the p, we get 10,000 minus 8,000. We got the 8,000 by multiplying 80 times p. And 10,000 minus 8,000 is again 2,000. So our quantity demanded equals our quantity supplied, which is good. It means we did it right. And so our equilibrium quantity is 2,000 and our equilibrium price is 100. So remember these steps when solving for the equilibrium. First, solve your supply and demand function in terms of quantity. So Q equals something. Then set your quantity supplied equal to your quantity demanded. Once you've done this, solve for P. That will be your equilibrium price. Then plug those P's back into your quantity supplied and quantity demand functions to solve for equilibrium quantity. And you can do it for one if you're confident in your math, but I recommend doing it for both just to double check your methods and make sure you did your algebra correctly.